SABC live from Johannesburg and also live from the Results Operations Centre in Pretoria. That's where we find my colleague Peter Ndoro. Peter, if you can hear me, what's happening at The Rock?
So thanks very much indeed. Yeah, look, as people who've been here before, I would say that this feels very much like the calm before the storm. This is day one of this week, day one of voting this week. The special votes are being cast by more than 700,000 people across the country. So it's starting to get a bit of a vibe going, but I only think that from tomorrow and definitely on Wednesday, that's when you're going to see a hive of activity here. But we already can see IEC officials working hard at work because they will be answering a lot of the queries here that will be coming through, especially regarding the special votes that are taking place across the country. And then the political parties themselves, I think, probably will start coming through from about tomorrow. And on Wednesday, this place will be buzzing very, very much. So from here, the rest of this afternoon, we're going to be continuing to explore these elections, what today means, tomorrow in terms of special votes. And also we'll be crossing to various reporters around the country, giving us a sense of what's happening where they are. But to start off our conversation, I thought we'd start with somebody who understands this process well, having spent more than 14 years as an electoral commissioner, and now is a executive chairperson of the Institute of Election Management Services in Africa. So this is a man who knows elections well, and the South African public know very well indeed. Terry Tselane, always a pleasure to talk to you. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me here. It's always a pleasure.
All right, so this is the first general election without the IEC hat on, but you understand this processes very well.
No, absolutely. I mean, I've been through this process for almost 20 years, and therefore I understand every aspect of the electoral processes.
All right, so let's talk about those processes. When does it begin for a general election such as this? A lot of people may want to feel tempted to think maybe soon after the local government elections. How far back do you have to go to put together elections like this?
Well, we've got to view the electoral process like firefighting. The firefighters, immediately after finishing extinguishing fire, they prepare for the next one. So it is the same as the electoral processes. So immediately after an election, the officials of the organization will get together. They receive the reports from the observer missions. They assess the processes that identify all the weaknesses within the system, and a process of actually now rectifying whatever has been found to be a weakness then begins. Now, one of the most important thing also is that you've got to remember that there is also another body that is very, very important in the electoral process. It's called the Demarcation Board. So the Demarcation Board will also start its own processes of demarcating either the wards or the provincial boundaries or any other boundary. And from there, they've got to supply that information to the Commission for the Commission to start now developing voting districts. That process is called the delimitation process. So that's where everything will then start from there. You've got to now start identifying materials that you are going to require. So you deal with the logistics, you deal with the electoral staff, you deal with the voters' roll, identify all the weaknesses within the system, and try to make sure that those measures are in place for you to be able to run the elections.
And I would imagine things like if there were long queues in certain areas in the past, you might think, do we then need another voting station nearby? Is that how you start to assess information from the past?
Absolutely. That's the process that we call delimitation of voting districts. So that process kicks in immediately after the Demarcation Board has actually done its work, and then the Commission will then look at the voting districts and begin to see how it can actually divide the voting districts according to the number of people who are in the voting district to make sure that whatever weaknesses that were identified are dealt with.
All right, we'll talk a little bit more about the generality of these elections, but today's quite special. On the 27th of last month, the elections actually started in earnest with the international voters, people voting at international stations. Here in South Africa, we have these special votes. What are they, and why are they so important?
Well, special votes, basically, it's almost a dry run for the organization. But it is also a platform that is used in order to cater for those people who are not able to go to the voting station on the day of the elections. You may recall that in 1999, just ahead of the 1999 elections, the commission was taken to court by organizations representing the prisoners, and the commission was therefore forced to also incorporate the prisoners as a category of people who at that stage were always qualifying for special votes. So when the process started, it was catering for people who are infirm, people who are elderly, people who are highly pregnant, and any other category of people like who are working in a security cluster, etc., etc. But as time went on, that was actually changed to now accommodate for anyone who would not be at the voting station on the day of the elections. But prior to this, which is the 6th and 7th of May, which is has been reserved for special votes, you recall that 2 weeks ago there were another category of special votes. This one was catering for an international segment of the voters' roll. So all people who are overseas who were not able to participate in elections, who would have applied for special vote, would have been catered for during that particular period. This time around, on the 6th and 7th, the Commission is catering only for those who are inside the country, but who are not able to be at their voting station on the day of the elections.
So that's the difference in 2019. All right, look, you consult now across the continent, and you've seen elections around the world, in fact. And I just wonder, when we start to use words like free and fair, what does that mean in the job of an elections body?
Well, basically, free and fair requires the election to function within a particular framework or environment. Now, there are 4 areas that I believe determine the integrity of the election. So those 4 areas are the areas that you must always watch out for when you assess whether the elections are free or fair or whether they are credible. The first one is the quality of the voters' roll. If there's a problem with the voters' roll, then you know that you have a problem with the election. So the voters' roll must be current, must only contain the names of people who are supposed to be participating in those elections. If you've got people like in certain countries where dead people appear on the voters' roll, or alternatively the minors, or people who are not supposed to be on the voters' roll being on the voters' roll, then it means we've got a problem with those elections. The credibility thereof cannot be guaranteed. The second aspect is the quality of the electoral staff. The electoral staff, they've got to know their staff, they've got to understand the legal framework within which the elections are happening, but they must also act impartially. So electoral staff plays a very important role in terms of determining the integrity of an election. The third one is the quality of the logistics. In other words, all these materials that are being ferried from one area to the other, do you have sufficient resources? Are these materials reaching the right places at the right time? So it's a very important aspect in determining also the credibility of the electoral processes. The last one is the political environment, and this will deal with all aspects pertaining to how the political parties conduct themselves. Are they adhering to a code of conduct? Is the Commission also impartial or perceived to be impartial in terms of the way it is deal with all aspects pertaining to the elections? So those 4 aspects are the aspects that you must actually always use as a yardstick to be able to measure the credibility and integrity of an election.
All right, so South Africa, fairly new democracy, and still finding our feet in some ways. How would you compare our election processes with the rest of the world and the rest of the continent? Where are we, do you think?
There are areas where we are far advanced, and then there are areas where we are lacking a little bit. When it comes to the voters' roll, our voters' roll is the most current voters' roll you can find in the whole continent. And I think it is very, very easy for us to say this because the voters' roll of South Africa, it's actually you assess it against the population register. In other words, immediately when you receive people, you check those people against the population register. It happens automatically. So that linkage is a very, very important one that helps us as a country to know who is actually supposed to be on the voters' roll and who's not supposed to be on the voters' roll. So I think we're very much advanced, because in some of the countries in the continent, we don't even have a population register. So it becomes very, very difficult when you don't have a population register to develop a voters' roll. But where are we lacking? I mean, if you look around the corner, Namibia has already moved into electronic voting. DRC has also started the last elections that they ran. They were largely using electronic machines to run those elections. So there are quite a number of areas where we could actually improve and try to be, at least up to speed in relation to our processes. But the transmission of our results, it's another area where I think we are quite good. Kenya was much faster, by the way, even though their election results were nullified.
You know what, we'll talk a little bit more about that, so don't go away, just stay with us, because what I'd like to do now is we're going to start crossing around the country and speak to our reporters on the ground to get a sense of the whole country. And we're going to start in KwaZulu-Natal, which is going to be one of those provinces that a lot of people will be watching, highly contested is regarded, and contributes hugely to the number of seats that will be available for people in Parliament. To give us a